The last 8 minutes of this film set a record for the highest number of simultaneous viewers in global cinema history because many couldn't face the truth. It may seem like an ordinary crime film, but why did it move so many hardened criminals to tears? And why did the silent director, Gao Yang, say, "I don't dare to end it this way"? There's only one reason. It touches on the fear everyone is most reluctant to confront. When I first watched it, I just thought the murderer committed the ultimate crime. When I first saw the film, I simply thought that the murderer, Mills, was a madman controlled by his religion. But as I began to think about it for the 5th time, maybe he was the only sober person in the whole story. And what's even more horrifying is that, when you analyze each and every one of the victims, you realize that they're all guilty of their own crimes. And that's why, 25 years after it was released, it's still being described as the most perfect crime film of all time. And today I'm going to take you on a new look at that film. Uncover the 3 main secrets surrounding him. Firstly, there exists a link among the 7 victims that is often overlooked, implying they might have been acquainted. Secondly, the head found in the box was not Tracy's, as per the original script. Thirdly, and most crucially, when Mills pulls the trigger at the film's conclusion, there's a subtle detail that 90% of viewers have never noticed. As the story unfolds, Detective Summer, with only 7 outfits left before his retirement, maintains his meticulous habits. For over 30 years, he has been organizing his attire with cufflinks, ties, and suspenders. This ritual isn't just a constant habit, it's the very essence of his identity as a detective, a man who has witnessed the darkness of human nature in a crime-ridden city. Yet he has never wavered in his commitment to the smallest details. These minute threads, often overlooked by others, frequently form the basis for the numerous crimes he has solved. It's these tiny clues, dismissed by others, that have often been the key to resolving his many unsolved cases. However, Summer could never have predicted the confrontation with evil that awaited him in his final week out of uniform. Then, Detective Mills, the young officer who had taken over for Summer, arrived on the scene. He rushed out of his car to meet the retiring legend, not even bothering to fully exit his vehicle. When questioned about his transfer from the big city to this one, Mills provided a straightforward explanation. Regarding what the director was aiming to convey, we shall eventually understand its significance. It truly was an uncommon chance to gain insight, yet Summer merely offered him a frosty glance. To Summer, it appeared that this assured young fellow failed to grasp the city's grim realities. However, as Summer was nearing retirement, he could only inform Mills that throughout the upcoming 7 days, he would be by his side at every moment. Destiny was ready to lead them on a dark and life-altering journey, with the clock ticking down to Monday. Summer and Mills were guided by light winds and heavy rain to a new location in Xiongan. For those who cared to notice, nearly 80% of the 7 deadly sins scenes were filmed in the rain, as if the city was perpetually under a cloud. Only in the last 10 minutes of the day's shooting did the skies suddenly clear. We shall have to wait and see what message the director intended to convey. We'll see. The victim seemed to be a rather obese man, almost on the brink of extinction, with his hands and feet tightly bound with thin wire. His entire face was buried in a plate of spaghetti, and a large amount of food scraps was scattered across the table, which he had clearly been eating continuously. At this moment, Mills observed a suspicious pail at the foot of the table. Driven by professional instinct, he bent down to inspect it. However, the sight almost caused him to vomit his entire meal, as the pail was filled with the man's vomit, the taste of which he had experienced. It became apparent that the bucket was indeed full of the man's vomit, with an unmistakable odor. The coroner could only confirm at the scene that the man had been deceased for quite some time. An additional autopsy was necessary to ascertain the precise cause of death. However, once the coroner opened the man's stomach, everyone in the room was struck with horror. The victim's stomach had expanded to more than 4 times its normal size, and the body was in a state of severe distension. Even more disturbingly, the entire digestive tract, from the duodenum to the end of the intestine, had been forcefully filled with food. This extreme distension had caused the organs to be torn and bloodied. Furthermore, the coroner noted that the victim's backside was also torn and bloodied, indicating the victim endured significant pain. The forensic pathologist observed substantial blunt force trauma to the back of the victim's head, implying that the assailant may have threatened him with a weapon and forced him to eat until his internal organs could no longer cope, resulting in his death. This was evidently a highly aberrant homicide. Summers conveyed his findings to the commissioner, exhibiting an uncommon look of concern. With his extensive experience, he deduced that this was not merely a case of vendetta. Instead, the murderer had repeatedly bought food from the nearby convenience store, intentionally extending the duration of the murder to ensure the food remained available to the public. It was a deliberately prolonged act. The victim's pain, why go so far if one killing suffices? Why go so far? Why go so far? Why go so far? Why go so far? The victim, a man with a remarkably small social circle and very few enemies, was chosen by the killer, who picked this seemingly unremarkable overweight man as his target. The killer had orchestrated such a savage death with some particular intention in mind. Summer had a strong suspicion that this was merely the start of what he feared would be a lengthy series of victims. He was reluctant to accept this burning offer of goodwill, especially as he was on the brink of retirement. Meanwhile, Mills, who was enthusiastic yet clearly lacking in experience, had concluded that the 2 men needed to continue working closely together to build the case. They must persist in their collaboration. The time is still not yet 24 hours into Tuesday morning. The police had another fatality on their hands. A prominent barrister was murdered in a luxury home, his body entirely drained of blood. Shockingly, the killer used the blood to write greed on the floor, alongside a pancake with a hint of severed flesh, like a grim judgment. The killer's methods were becoming increasingly bizarre and puzzling to Mills. Meanwhile, Sammer was quietly organizing his files, seemingly focused on a peaceful professional life. He appeared to plan a calm end to his career, but the secretary's visit brought news of the lawyer's murder and played on emotions, concerned that Sammer had unfinished cases before retirement. On leaving, the secretary handed the coroner what was found in the fat man's stomach. He gave it to Sommer as a memento. Knowing Sommer's nature, the commissioner was sure he wouldn't ignore the case, and he was right. That afternoon, Sommer returned alone to Humpty Dumpty's house. He inspected every corner and discovered strange marks under the fridge. He retrieved bottle fragments, placed them on top, and they reassembled. Realizing the fridge had been moved, he shifted the heavy appliances and erased 2 large hidden letters from the wall, revealing the words overeating with a note. It states, "The road is long and hard, out of hell, into light." A well-known line from Milton's Paradise Lost. This is also the source of the 7 deadly sins of the Catholic faithful, indicating the murderer is following the order of the 7 sins as listed. Now, with the emergence of tyranny and avarice, and the potential for 5 innocent victims, this case clearly cannot be solved quickly. Sammer informed the secretary of his deduction, and stressed he would not be taking on the case, even though he wouldn't consider it in the short term. Nonetheless, after work, Sommer visited the library to research materials, one of which was the Denning Divine Comedy. This book, detailing the punishment of sinners across hell's various levels, caught his attention due to its similarity to the methods used in the 2 murders. Meanwhile, in Canada, Mills was also busy reviewing materials. However, instead of the Bible or philosophical works, he was examining a collection of children's stories authored by Kate. Behind the seemingly trivial choices, he sought to understand the case. The next day, Sommer compiled his deductions into a notebook and placed it on Mills's desk, but he hadn't officially retired yet, so if he could help, he did. As Mills was preparing to take his office, his wife Tracy called. Surprisingly, Tracy demanded to speak to Sommer, as the couple had just moved to the city and usually didn't have any friends, and Mills often brought up his admiration of the old detective at home, but he was still in a state of shock. So, Tracy wanted to invite Sommer over for dinner, creating a surprisingly warm and friendly atmosphere. Sommer was acutely aware of Tracy's profound love for her husband and how Mills often overlooked his wife's feelings due to his work. However, as an outsider, she could only silently watch the interactions of the young couple. After enjoying a hearty meal, the 2 detectives returned to their work, re-evaluating the case and exchanging their findings in an effort to discern a pattern in what appeared to be a chaotic mix of clues. Sommer noted that although the killer's methods seemed erratic, each action appeared to hold a specific significance. Was the photograph of the eyes covered with paint indicative of something? Mills, despite suggesting that the deceased's wife had an alibi, found her to be the only viable lead at the moment. The 2 men promptly hurried to the safe house where the woman, still somewhat unstable, finally remembered that her husband's words from his office seemed unfinished, and in light of Mills's attractiveness, she recalled overhearing a woman's voice. Instead, both returned to the office, removed the painting from the wall, and the suspects searched it but found nothing. The fingerprints on the wall spelled "I am" and didn't match the deceased. So, whose were they? After a night of database checks, shockingly, they belonged to a recidivist named Victor. His criminal record is thoroughly documented at the police station, and he has been diagnosed with a severe mental illness. However, Sommer's instincts strongly suggest that this man isn't the actual killer. He believes the suspect is too obvious, and by now, a substantial police force has already been mobilized. It's evident no one is willing to listen to him, compelling him to visit the scene with Mills. SWAT Curtin breaks into Victor's house, and is astounded to find that the barely recognizable figure in bed is the same person as when he was killed. On the bed lay a barely human figure, his entire body carbonized, as if weathered for a century. On the wall were the words "awakening," "difficulty," which was apparently the last thing the 3rd victim, Samuel Murray, noticed. On the floor was a photograph with a date, indicating that Victor had been confined to his bed for an entire year, and during that time his ordeal was thoroughly documented. At that moment, a visiting police officer slowly approached. "He's alive. Lock him up. Help me." Mills was in a frenzy, convinced the killer had been toying with them like a hunter with a dog on a lead, believing all the paths had been meticulously planned. Samuels was attempting to persuade Mills to calm down, urging him to set his emotions aside and not be distracted by them. However, before Samuels could finish speaking, the flashing lights at the bottom of the stairs suddenly illuminated. At some point, a reporter wandered in, and with no outlet for his anger, Mills charged at the reporter, seized the camera, and forcefully expelled him from the premises. The reporter was violently removed from the location, and they were compelled to leave. Meanwhile, the news from the hospital was even more depressing, as Mektu was still alive, but a vegetable, and according to the doctor's account, his bodily functions had deteriorated and disappeared, and he'd bitten off his own tongue during this period of captivity. And if it weren't for the medication, he'd have been dead already. Besides, It was nearly impossible to get the murderer's name from him. At the police station, Sommer realized that if he followed the old protocol, the police might not catch the murderer before he completed the 7 deadly sins, so he decided to think differently. Since the murderer was a fervent believer, Sommer would need to reconstruct the 7 deadly sins using historical documents, requiring extensive documentation. Back then, there was no deep searching, so the only option was to identify the murderer. So Sommer reached out to his informant, requesting a list of everyone who borrowed religious texts. In the car, Mills reviewed the loan records and noted that few had borrowed theological works, but one man stood out. He frequently borrowed religious texts and also studied criminal psychology, likely raising Sommer's suspicions. However, when the 2 men eventually located the suspect's flat at the address they were searching for, they found it empty, and Mills was on the verge of breaking in when a figure emerged at the far end of the hallway. Before the 2 men had the chance to question Sommer, the suspect swiftly drew his gun, fired a shot, and then turned to flee. Mills is young, strong, yet inexperienced, and upon reaching a narrow alley, he discovers the man has vanished, unaware that the murderer is already positioned on the roof of the car, waiting for Mills to unwittingly fall into the trap. The stark contrast between Mills's exposed back and the shadowy figure on the car roof underscores the dramatic reversal of the roles of the hunter and the hunted. Yet, in a surprising twist, when the murderer presses a gun against Mills's temple, he refrains from pulling the trigger, as if it were merely a deceptive trick from the past. It was an elaborate game. When Sommer arrived, the murderer was gone. A humiliated Mills, eyes blazing, ignored Sommer's advice, kicked in the flat door without a warrant, filled it with search gear, plastered twisted religious imagery on the walls, and then had to open the door. What's even more astonishing is that the murderer had previously encountered the 2 men the reporter Mills had driven away, a discovery that puts the entire investigation on high alert. The 2 detectives are deeply unsettled by the killer's impressive psychological and disguise abilities. Not only did the murderer excel in the cat-and-mouse game, but he even managed to get quite close to them. As the police were in the midst of searching for clues, the phone in the room unexpectedly rang. The calm and courteous voice on the line belonged to the murderer, who initially mentioned to the police that they had secured a safe place to hide. The voice on the other end is calm and polite. It's the killer, who first expresses astonishment that the police have discovered a hideout. He then apologizes to Mills, and in a provocative manner, hangs up the phone. Despite uncovering a wealth of information in the room, the police have been unable to find any fingerprints, indicating that the killer remains an unknown entity. Soon enough, the time arrives, and it's Saturday, and yet another person has been murdered, this time a prostitute. Symbolizing the 7 deadly sins of sexual desire, it's been a strange and thrilling encounter, and the killer is now someone who has been killed. For those interested, you can watch the original film, but I won't delve into details here. This time, the police find a witness, but he's too scared to offer any clues. Then, on Sunday, the murderer calls the police with the victim's address. When Sommer and Mills arrive, they find a woman's body in bed, with pride written beside her. Why is this woman representing pride? The killer cruelly disfigured the woman's face, yet he offered her a chance to live. However, the woman, who was a renowned model, found herself unable to cope with the disfigurement. In her pride, she decided to take the pills and end her own life. Summers, who is actually retired now, decided to stay on for a few more days. He knows that this Lotus case isn't merely a straightforward game of manhunt. Summers believes it will inevitably end in tragedy. Besides, all he has left is his anger, and he doesn't mind a few extra days, because he refuses to abandon Mills. What truly mattered was that he didn't abandon Mills. But just as the 2 men were preparing to return to the office, a man, drenched in blood, walked into the station. Police. Having discovered the identity of the murderer, John Doe, an exceptionally intelligent and affluent religious fanatic, Sommer and Mills find themselves perplexed as to why he has chosen to surrender. The most apparent reason, which is also the final one, is on the verge of being fulfilled. What could be the motive behind his unexpected emergence? John has informed the police, via his legal representative, that 2 bodies remain undiscovered. To reveal their locations, he insists that only Sommer and Mills can accompany him to uncover where they have been concealed. The police, of course, could not accede to this unreasonable request, but the solicitor said that if he didn't, he would instruct me to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, and if he did, he would sign the plea, and finally the secretary gritted his teeth and told Sommer and Mills to suit up and accompany John for the walk, and then the scene of the evacuation was to be revealed. The final twist in the story, and the one that countless people will never forget. John sits in the back row. His hands, restrained, are disturbingly calm, his eyes clear and focused, unlike the madman killer one imagines. Seymour and Mills sit in the front, one experienced but weary, the other young and impulsive yet just. The dialogue that follows is a philosophical debate on humanity's nature about John Pugh, who thinks he's insane, a man of his own accord, feeling reality's cause is moral. He believed the world was morally bankrupt, with violence, greed, and laziness as norms. The camera panned to Sommer, whose eyes showed complexity, having seen too much of humanity's darker side to understand John's anger, yet unable to identify with his methods. I kept thinking, what is it? Are you aware you're mad? Mills attempts to gain a psychological edge with his taunts, but John mirrors Mills's provocations back at him. As Niels's emotions nearly spiral out of control, he reaches his destination. Light and shadow play across his face, like two sides of humanity. His view of innocence is stark. Obese men, lawyers, drug dealers, prostitutes, and models aren't innocent to him, but symbols of tolerated sin. John isn't defending himself, he's judging this world repeatedly. This is followed by John's intentional mention of Niels's good life, a seemingly harmless comment with a destructive undertone the audience might not yet grasp. What seems like ordinary dialogue is actually the sixth patriarch's most desperate confession, and the perfect lure for the seventh patriarch's fury. Just as Niels is about to lose his hold on reality, his destination arrives, compelling him to leave the box behind. Now, as the sunlight grows stronger, this visual transformation signals the final judgment. The transcendent expression on John's face, as if he's already glimpsed the end, suggests that this 10-minute dialogue in the car is the ideological core of the film. It is a psychological trap, crafted as a surprise, where John is not a murderer simply waiting to be caught, but rather, a participant who controls the situation. As you watch the dialogue again, you begin to understand that every sentence is a strategic ambush, revealing that when anger prevails over sanity, human nature will be utterly broken. When anger overtakes reason, the very foundation of human nature will be destroyed. Just as John and Mills head to the burial site, a boxcar arrives from the distant side of the road. In this desolate place, Samuel initially suspects it's a robbery, and fires his gun as a warning. However, after learning that the man is merely a courier, instructed to deliver the box on time for £50 to a man named Mills, Samuel leaves the box behind. The camera reveals that Mills and Mills have been ensnared, yet they are not captured, they are being controlled. Mills and John was further away, and as the two men reached a standoff, John was kneeling, appearing mercifully submissive, yet he exuded an eerie kind of confidence. After observing for a moment, when he was satisfied that there was no danger, Seymour began to prepare to open the box. He first slit the tape with his knife and noticed bloodstains. Meanwhile, Mills was watching intently, sensing something was amiss. John, still on his knees, kept up a constant stream of verbally provocative remarks, which likely indicated that he envied him his life, and that he would never be able to escape with it. However, he would never be able to escape with it, and he would never be able to escape with it. Life. Oh. When Satsuma sees the contents of the box, he stands up in utter bewilderment. In the context of all the details of the film, it seems that the box holds the head of Tracy. However, the original script intended for the box to contain Mills's unborn child. The producers, considering it too cruel, decided to abandon this idea. The director, taking a very different approach, deliberately chose not to reveal what was inside the box. This decision was made because the imagination would conjure something far more horrific than actually showing it. At this moment, Satsuma understands that there is no body inside. He immediately rushes towards Mills, while John persistently continues to provoke him. Can you hear me? Police? On the surface, Mills hoped that Sommer would deny it, but his silence confirmed the most horrific truth of all, that in the face of the loss of his wife and the uncertainty of fatherhood, Mills's rage finally exploded, and he pulled the trigger, completing the final act of John's plan, the rage of Sommer, who had witnessed the tragic end of the entire story, and who could have prevented it, but chose to remain silent, because, as he concludes, quoting Ernest Hemingway, in the first part of the film, John is the only person who could have prevented it, and the only person who could have prevented it. The concept of justice in a world devoid of hope has become unclear, and the film concludes at this point. Now, let's examine three aspects from the start of the film. Firstly, the concealed link between John and his victims. John's selection of victims isn't arbitrary. It's a meticulously crafted network of revenge that outwardly implies the victims might have been part of a moral lapse. The victims each symbolize a crime: the lawyer, greed; the fat man, gluttony; the woman, lust; the model, arrogance. However, a closer look at the dialogue and scene details reveals a deeper link. A key clue emerges as Victor's arrest approaches, and the commissioner explains that his repeated crimes go unpunished due to the attorney's frequent defenses, while John is overly strict in his car interrogations. The lawyer defended Conan because he profited from clearing guilty men, and it's logical that Victor, as a criminal, would often encounter lust in the city's darker areas. These roles form a connected criminal network, implying a shared moral failing. John's careful victim selection, not only represents crimes, but also the roles each played in a specific incident. It is a targeted punishment for each individual's role in a specific event, which explains why the journal Sarno found in John's house was so detailed. He didn't choose randomly. It was a precise hit after thorough investigation. The box's contents are already explained, so let's discuss the detachment in Mills's eyes at the film's end when he shoots John. This subtle expression shift, easy to miss in a quick cut, alters the story's interpretation. John's smile hints this was his plan's goal, not just to complete the 7 deadly sins with his death, but to show that anyone can succumb to extreme rage. Okay, this is the E-Star. See you next time.